Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. April 1945. Children sent to cellars. Old men gathered in hushed rooms. Women pressing their ears against the walls, listening for something. Some distant thunder, some mechanical growl coming over the hills. And out there, somewhere beyond the tree line, tens of thousands of American soldiers are moving east. Tanks, artillery, half-tracks rolling in long iron columns through shattered villages and burning fields. The war is ending. Everyone knows it. The radio still broadcasts, still spits propaganda about miraculous weapons and inevitable German victory. But nobody believes it anymore. The men who came back from the front, the ones missing limbs and wearing hollow eyes, they know the truth. The refugees streaming in from the west, the ones who left everything behind, they know it too. Germany is losing. Germany has lost. It's only a question of what the last weeks will cost. And in town after town across the Reich, that question is being answered in blood and rubble, but not everywhere. Tonight we tell the story of the German towns that made a different choice, the communities where ordinary people, farmers, priests, doctors, mayors, decided that survival mattered more than symbolism. Where white sheets were hung from windows, where soldiers were persuaded to leave, where the war ended not with artillery and fire, but with silence. It is a story about a kind of courage that military history rarely honors, the courage not to fight. Germany on fire. The last months. To understand what made these choices so remarkable, you first have to understand what was happening to Germany in those final months of the war, because the picture was not of a nation gracefully accepting defeat. It was of a country tearing itself apart, fanatically, in the ruins of an ideology that had already destroyed it. By the beginning of 1945, Germany had been at war for more than 5 years. The bombing campaigns had been running since 1940, and by the final year, they had reached an almost incomprehensible scale. Over 70% of Germany's largest cities had seen their urban cores destroyed. The figures are difficult to absorb even now. In Cologne, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Berlin, Nuremberg, Essen, and Dresden, entire neighborhoods had been reduced to jagged walls and open sky. Across Germany, some 4.8 million housing units had been destroyed. Roughly 13 million Germans were homeless. And there were 400 million cubic meters of rubble waiting to be cleared. A number so large it barely seems real. At the same time, on the ground, the Allied armies were closing in from every direction. In the West, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine in March 1945, and by April, they were fanning out into the German heartland with an overwhelming combination of firepower, mobility, and material abundance. American artillery units were firing at a pace that stunned German commanders. During the Ruhr Pocket campaign alone, artillery attached to U.S. 16th Corps fired no fewer than 259,000 rounds in 2 weeks. The German military commanders trying to stop them were working with decimated divisions, fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, and units increasingly composed of boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm Home Defense Militia. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German supreme commander in the West, privately compared his situation to playing a Beethoven sonata on a broken, out-of-tune piano. The Soviet armies were closing in from the east with equal brutality and far greater ruthlessness. Berlin was encircled. Hitler was underground in his bunker, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, moving phantom divisions around a map, raging at the generals he blamed for the collapse of everything he had built. And yet, and this is the crucial part, the official orders from Berlin were unchanged. Every city was to be defended to the last, Every town was to resist. No surrender, no retreat. The language coming out of the Nazi leadership was the language it had always used: sacrifice, honor, the final hour of heroism before the inevitable reversal. For the towns and cities that obeyed those orders, the results were catastrophic. What happened to the towns that fought? You don't have to look far to find the examples. They are everywhere in the historical record of that spring, repeated in city after city, like a grim and inevitable pattern. Take Nuremberg. This was a city of deep symbolic importance to the Nazi regime, the site of the famous rallies, the showcase of Hitler's new Germany, the city where the Nuremberg laws had been announced in 1935, stripping Jews of their citizenship. When American forces of the Seventh Army approached in April 1945, the local Nazi leadership made the decision to fight. The city was declared a fortress. German forces dug in. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned as ground weapons, and the result was 5 days of some of the most vicious urban combat of the entire Western campaign. American artillery began shelling the historic old city on April 17th. By the time the fighting ended on April 20th, the city had been devastated. Buildings that had stood for centuries were rubble. The ancient Nuremberg Castle, one of the most significant medieval structures in Germany, was badly damaged. Thousands of civilians who had survived years of bombing then lived through days of street-by-street fighting in what remained of their homes. The city finally fell. It always was going to fall. The only question was the price, and the price was enormous, borne almost entirely by the civilians who had no say in the decision to fight. Or consider Aschaffenburg, a Bavarian city on the Main River. Hitler personally declared it a Festungsstadt, a fortress city, and a Wehrmacht commander named Major Emil Lamberth was put in charge of the defense and swore a personal oath to Hitler to hold the city. The defense relied, in part, on terror to sustain itself. SS overseers interfered constantly with Lamberth's decisions, and at least one officer who showed insufficient enthusiasm was executed. Bodies were reportedly hanged from lampposts to discourage any sign of defeatism among the defenders. American forces fought for 10 days to take the city, from late March into early April 1945. Artillery and mortar fire were directed at buildings constantly. The destruction was severe. When it was finally over and Lamberth hung white flags from what remained of the city's Renaissance castle, U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson addressed it directly in a press conference. He said that Aschaffenburg provided a lesson in what happened when Nazi fanatics used the threat of execution to force soldiers and civilians to fight for a week in a hopeless cause. These weren't isolated cases. Across the Ruhr, towns like Dortmund, Wuppertal, and Hamm kept fighting while nearby mayors in Duisburg and Essen chose to present white flags to approaching American forces. American soldiers who had come through weeks of hard fighting had developed a clear and brutal policy in response to resistance. A single sniper shot could trigger an artillery barrage. A mortar round fired from a neighborhood could result in that neighborhood being reduced to rubble within hours. The Americans had firepower on a scale that simply did not leave room for any realistic hope of successful German defense. The GIs who were out there knew the war was almost over, and they had no patience for dying in the last days of it. Their instinct, when they met resistance, was overwhelming force. One American veteran described it plainly: any sign of resistance. A rifle shot, an ambush, a stray mortar round seemed to madden the American units. The result was almost always the same: a hailstorm of fire that flattened everything around it. The terror keeping people in line. Understanding the choices that ordinary Germans faced in those weeks requires understanding one more thing: the threat that waited for anyone who tried to surrender. The SS was still active. The Gestapo was still watching. and Hitler's regime, even in its death throes, was still killing its own people. It's estimated that in the final weeks of the war, SS and police units summarily executed up to 10,000 German soldiers, and civilians suspected of cowardice, defeatism, or any indication of willingness to surrender. 10,000. This is a figure drawn from post-war historical research and corroborated by eyewitness accounts from across occupied Germany. The examples are specific and harrowing. In Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in, the SS hanged soldiers from lampposts and left their bodies swinging at crossroads and bridges. Signs were placed around the necks of the dead with messages designed to shame anyone who might consider following their example. At a place called Zionskirchplatz, a civilian named Friedrich Schwarz was hanged for raising a white flag from his window. In a neighborhood of Schöneberg, a sergeant was strung up from a lamppost with a sign accusing him of cowardice. This was happening not just in Berlin, but across the Reich. In the Austrian town of Werwolf, Nazi loyalists were shooting at any window that displayed a white flag or an Austrian flag, and were summarily executing men found in the streets who might be suspected of being deserters. In Düsseldorf, an anti-Nazi resistance group attempted to arrange the peaceful surrender of the city to spare it from further destruction. SS units crushed them and executed several of those involved. The Werwolf program was also a factor in civilian psychology, even if its actual impact turned out to be far smaller than feared. Heinrich Himmler had established these units in late 1944. Volunteers from the Waffen-SS and Hitler Youth, who were supposed to remain behind in occupied territory and conduct sabotage and assassination campaigns against Allied forces and German collaborators. Goebbels ran a propaganda station called Radio Werwolf starting on April 1, 1945, urging all Germans to rise up and resist. Allied intelligence was genuinely concerned that Werwolf units would make post-war occupation a nightmare of guerrilla violence. The threat was real enough in people's minds. In March 1945, Werwolf operatives had successfully assassinated Franz Oppenhoff, the American-appointed mayor of Aachen, using a team of teenage SS trainees. That single killing had a profound, chilling effect on any German who might consider cooperating with the Allies before the war was officially over. So the choice facing a small-town mayor in April 1945 was genuinely impossible. Follow orders and organize resistance, and watch your town be shelled to rubble and your people killed in the streets. Surrender and risk the SS or Werwolf units showing up to execute you and hang your body from a lamppost as a warning to others. And yet, some of them found a way through. The way towns that chose differently. The specific towns where this happened varied in their circumstances, but they shared a common thread. Someone in a position of local authority decided that the lives of ordinary people mattered more than the edicts of a regime that was already finished. In Apolda, a town in Thuringia, the critical moment came on April 11, 1945, when the Wehrmacht sent a combat commander to the town with orders to defend it to the last. The man they sent was supposed to organize a resistance that would, given the military situation, have resulted in the town's destruction and the deaths of many of its residents. But after consultation with local officials, including the mayor, Julius Dietz, the garrison commander Ludwig Edinger made the decision to refuse his orders. It was an extraordinary act. Refusing a direct military order in Nazi Germany in April 1945 was not a bureaucratic infraction. It was potentially a death sentence. Edinger signed a written document to that effect, knowing what it could cost him. Dietz personally carried that document the next day to the commander of the approaching American forces. On April 12, 1945, Apolda was surrendered peacefully to Major Edwin Trowbridge and elements of the U.S. 6th Armored Division. Not a shot was fired. The town survived intact. Heidelberg offers another remarkable case. The city had little heavy industry, making it a low-priority bombing target throughout the war. It had a large number of hospitals, and there were strong indications that American planners had already identified it as a desirable post-war garrison location. When American forces got Heidelberg's officials on the phone and demanded surrender, they received it. The U.S. 63rd Infantry Division entered the city on March 29, 1945, and the civilian population offered no resistance. Apart from the Wehrmacht's destruction of several Neckar River bridges to slow the Allied advance, the city was completely unharmed. Today it stands as one of the best-preserved historic cities in Germany, precisely because of that decision. Goslar, a medieval city in Lower Saxony, surrendered peacefully to approaching American forces and came through the war without significant damage. Bamberg, with its extraordinary collection of timber frame buildings and its Baroque cathedral, saw no heavy ground fighting and survived essentially intact. Regensburg, considered the largest German city to have survived the war without meaningful damage, managed to navigate the end of the war without the kind of last-stand battle that destroyed so many comparable cities. In Tübingen, the initiative of a local garrison doctor helped facilitate a peaceful surrender to French troops. Town after town across Bavaria and central Germany, wherever the combination of circumstances and individual courage aligned, found a way to arrive at April 30 or May 8th still standing. And in many smaller villages, whose names never made the history books, the same quiet dramas played out. Someone made a decision. Someone prepared the white cloth. Someone persuaded the soldiers to leave before the tanks arrived. The mechanics of a quiet surrender. How did they actually do it? Because the mechanics of surrendering without being caught surrendering. At a time when the SS was still executing people for defeatism, required a particular kind of careful, courageous improvisation. In most cases, there was no formal declaration. There couldn't be. A written announcement of surrender or a public ceremony would have given the SS or local Nazi Party officials all the pretext they needed to intervene, arrest the relevant officials, and impose a violent defense. So the process had to be quiet, conducted in whispers and through private conversations. The first step was usually getting the Wehrmacht soldiers out. If there were no defenders, there could be no defense. This sometimes meant persuading officers to declare the town of no strategic value and withdraw their troops before the Americans arrived. It sometimes meant quietly directing soldiers to leave their weapons and simply walk away. In some cases, local officials used the chaos of the collapsing German military bureaucracy to their advantage. Orders got lost, units got reassigned, commanders developed convenient reasons to redeploy their forces. The German military machine in April 1945 was so fractured, so overwhelmed, that a determined local official often had more room to maneuver than he would have had at any earlier point in the war. The second step was the preparation of surrender signals. The white sheet or tablecloth hung from a window was the universal symbol, recognized by Allied forces as meaning exactly what it meant. But this had to be done at exactly the right moment. Too early, and SS patrols might see it and respond with violence. Too late, and the advancing Americans might have already called in artillery support based on the assumption that the town was defended. The timing required someone watching the roads very carefully and acting at precisely the moment when American forces were close enough to see the signal, but no SS unit was close enough to punish it. The third element was making sure that the first American soldiers who arrived found exactly what they hoped to find. No resistance, no ambush, nothing that would trigger the overwhelming force response that the GIs were prepared and conditioned to deliver. When American scouts entered these surrendered towns, cautiously, weapons ready, watching every window and doorway, they found a very different landscape than they were used to. No barricades blocking the streets, no rifle fire from upper windows, no sudden explosions, just silence and white cloth, and sometimes an old man or a local official walking toward them with his hands visible, empty, raised. The Americans understood the signal immediately. Their orders were clear. If a town did not resist, it was not destroyed. Supplies might be requisitioned. Soldiers would be disarmed and processed. A curfew would be imposed. Communications equipment confiscated. Weapons turned over. General Eisenhower's Proclamation Number 1, copies of which were posted in every occupied town, began with the words, "We come as a victorious army, not as oppressors." The town would stand. The church would still have its tower. The farmhouses would still have their roofs. The families inside them would still be alive. The arrival. Try to imagine what it felt like from inside one of these towns on the morning the Americans came. You've been living with the sound of artillery for days. It rumbles in from the west like permanent thunder, getting closer each day. The roads into town are full of exhausted, hollow-eyed men in ragged Wehrmacht uniforms who have been walking for weeks. Refugees are camped in the church hall and the schoolroom. Your children haven't slept properly in months. You've been rationing food since autumn, and then someone in the street starts shouting. The sound is different, not artillery. Engines, big ones, the unmistakable mechanical grinding of tracked vehicles. And you look down the main road, and you see them. American armored vehicles, moving slowly, halted, scouts on foot moving ahead of the column, rifles up, eyes scanning. One of them looks up at your window. You feel your heart in your throat, because in your window, or your neighbor's window, or from the church tower, there is white cloth hanging in the morning air. Everything depends on the next 30 seconds. The scout looks at the white cloth. He looks back at the column. He says something into his radio. The column keeps moving forward. No artillery, no machine gun fire, no explosion. Just the grinding of tank treads on cobblestones and the shuffling boots of infantry soldiers who look exhausted but not threatening, who are looking around your town the way tired men look at a place where nothing is trying to kill them. And then someone, the mayor, a priest, a local official, walks out with his hands up or his arms spread wide, or just walking with the deliberate, measured pace of someone trying very hard to look exactly like what they are. A person who has no weapons and does not want to fight. And the town survives. Accounts from American veterans describe the relief these moments provided. The Gias were fighting a war they knew was almost over. They had watched their friends die in Nuremberg, in Aschaffenburg, in the Ruhr, in the forests of the Hurtgen. Every day of continued fighting was a day somebody didn't make it home. When they entered a town that had chosen not to fight, there was something almost disorienting about the stillness, a kind of cautious, suspended peace that felt, after so many months, almost impossible to trust. But it was real, and it held. The danger that never went away. Even once the Americans arrived, even once the town was occupied and the immediate danger of artillery had passed, the situation remained complicated and fraught. The werewolf threat, exaggerated as it turned out to be in practice, was taken seriously by American commanders throughout the spring and summer of 1945. Allied intelligence reports in May 1945 were still asserting that the werewolf organization was not a myth. American soldiers who had been warned repeatedly about guerrilla ambushes, fake surrenders, and hidden fanatics were understandably tense in occupied German towns. Any hint of resistance, any unexpected movement, any civilian who behaved in a way that read as suspicious could trigger a response that ended badly. This meant that even the Germans who had made the decision to surrender peacefully had to maintain that peace with considerable care. The occupation had its own difficulties. Supplies were requisitioned, sometimes harshly. Curfews were strictly enforced, movement was restricted, and the non-fraternization orders that American forces operated under in the early weeks of occupation created a cold, impersonal atmosphere in which the occupied population and their occupiers existed in the same space without really interacting. For the mayors and local officials who had made the call to surrender, there was also the question of what would come next politically. The denazification process that the Americans imposed meant that anyone who had held official positions during the Nazi era was subject to investigation, questioning, and potential removal from office. Mayor Julius Dietz of Apolda, who had played a central role in the peaceful surrender of his town, was later removed from his position when Soviet forces took over the region as part of the post-war zone allocations established at Yalta. His further fate is not recorded in the historical documents that survive. In many cases, the men who had facilitated quiet surrenders found themselves in ambiguous positions. They had served the Nazi administrative structure while simultaneously working against it at the critical moment. The moral accounting was complicated, as it was for much of German society in those years. What usually happened instead? It's worth pausing here to really let the contrast sink in, because the towns that survived are remarkable precisely because of how different they were from the norm. Across the Ruhr, artillery units attached to American corps were firing hundreds of thousands of rounds per day. In 2 weeks of fighting in the Ruhr pocket, American guns may have fired something close to 1 million shells across the entire operation. The cities of Dortmund, Wuppertal, and Hamm were fought through building by building. Some German officers took to confiscating white handkerchiefs from their troops, not wanting them to have anything that could be waved as a flag of surrender. In Berlin, when Soviet forces closed in, the final battle lasted 10 days and produced some of the most intense urban combat in the history of warfare. Soviet casualties in the Battle of Berlin were around 80,000 killed. German military losses were approximately 20,000 soldiers. Civilian deaths in Berlin during those final weeks reached around 30,000. The city that emerged from that battle was something barely recognizable as a city at all, a moonscape of ruins, bodies, and trauma. Even towns of modest size paid enormous prices for deciding to fight. Aschaffenburg was so heavily damaged by 10 days of intense combat that the Renaissance castle at its center, one of the most architecturally significant buildings in the region, had to be extensively restored after the war. Würzburg, a historic city of remarkable Baroque architecture, was bombed by over 200 RAF Lancaster aircraft on the night of March 16, 1945, in a raid that lasted less than 20 minutes and killed over 5,000 people. 90% of the inner city was destroyed. The pattern was cruelly consistent. A town with no realistic strategic significance, no hope of relief, no prospect of changing the outcome of the war, would fight for a week or two because fanatical local Nazi officials or SS overseers refused to permit surrender. Artillery and airstrikes would reduce it to rubble, and then it would be occupied anyway, as it always was going to be, and the surviving civilians would sift through the ruins trying to find anything that remained of their lives. The broader lesson. There is a temptation in telling a story like this to frame it too neatly, to say that the towns that surrendered were wise while the towns that fought were foolish, and leave it at that. But the reality was more tangled, and it's worth sitting with that complexity for a moment. The people who chose to fight, the German officers who held their positions, the soldiers who manned the barricades, were not all fanatical true believers. Many of them were fighting because they were ordered to under threat of death if they refused. Many were frightened young men or old men who had no realistic alternative. The terror that the SS maintained over the German population in those final weeks was real, and it trapped enormous numbers of people in situations they could not escape without risking execution. The men who managed to arrange peaceful surrenders were not simply braver or more clear-sighted than everyone else. They were often operating in specific circumstances that gave them slightly more room to maneuver. Towns with less strategic value, regions where SS control was thinner, situations where the timing allowed for the quiet removal of defenders before anyone with the authority to stop them noticed. The combination of individual courage and circumstantial luck that produced a peaceful surrender was different in every case. But what is consistent across all of these stories is the presence of at least one person who made a choice. One mayor who understood that there was nothing worth defending in the rubble of a finished regime. One garrison commander who signed a document refusing his orders, even knowing what that could cost him. One priest who walked out to meet the incoming troops. One ordinary citizen who hung a white sheet from a window at exactly the right moment. History tends to celebrate the dramatic acts of resistance, the fighters, the holdouts, the men who died refusing to surrender. And there is genuine courage in those stories. But April 1945 was not a moment when resistance changed anything. The war was over. The only question was who would pay the price for the final weeks of denial. The people who arranged quiet surrenders understood something that the Nazi leadership refused to acknowledge, that survival itself was an act of defiance against a regime that had decided the German people should die fighting for a cause already lost. German historian Golo Mann observed in his History of Germany that the readiness of ordinary Germans to work with the Allied occupiers to carry out their orders and accept their help was genuine. The guerrilla resistance that Allied commanders feared never materialized in any meaningful way. The German people, as a whole, were exhausted, and they chose life. After the war, the towns that made it through intact faced a different kind of challenge in the years that followed. Occupation brought its own hardships. Food shortages, curfews, the displacement of millions of people across a continent, trying to put itself back together. The denazification process imposed by the Allies sought to remove from positions of authority anyone who had played a meaningful role in the Nazi system, which created its own complications when many of the local officials who had arranged peaceful surrenders were themselves nominally part of that system. In Heidelberg, the Americans moved into the former Wehrmacht barracks almost immediately and established it as a major garrison, which brought economic activity and a degree of stability, but also created a kind of layered occupation that would last for decades. The city that had been spared bombing became a headquarters city, its streets shared between American soldiers and German civilians navigating a new and unfamiliar reality. In many of the smaller Bavarian and Thuringian villages, the experience was more austere. Supplies were requisitioned, sometimes extensively. Anything the American forces needed, food, livestock, vehicles, farm equipment, was taken. Families that had survived the war intact found themselves stripped of resources in the weeks and months of occupation. The distinction between liberation and occupation was sometimes difficult to feel in practical terms. But the buildings were still standing. The church towers were still there. The houses hadn't been reduced to foundations and broken walls. The people were alive. And that was the point. The historical record of southern Germany and Thuringia in those final weeks of the war is full of similar stories. Stories that didn't make the headlines because they were, by definition, stories about things that didn't happen. No artillery barrage, no burning buildings, no deaths in the street. Just silence and white cloth in the morning air and the grinding sound of a tank column moving through a town that had decided to survive. The question of courage. Military culture has a complicated relationship with surrender. Throughout history, The men and women who fight to the last have been celebrated in song and story. The defenders of Thermopylae, the last stand at the Alamo, the garrison that refused to break even when the cause was hopeless. There is something in human nature that responds to that kind of defiance, that finds it honorable and meaningful even in defeat. But April 1945 was not a moment where defiance had any strategic meaning. The war in Europe was finished. The only thing still being negotiated in city after city and town after town was the price of the final days. And in every case where a German town chose to fight to the last, ordinary civilians paid that price without having made the choice themselves. The courage of the men and women who arranged quiet surrenders was a different kind. It didn't look like courage from the outside. It looked like compliance, or pragmatism, or simply the inevitable. There were no songs written about the mayor who talked the Wehrmacht commander into withdrawing his troops. No monuments to the woman who hung the first white sheet from a second-floor window as American tanks rounded the bend in the road below. But consider what those acts actually required. Consider doing what Julius Dietz of Apolda did, sitting across from a combat commander who had sworn an oath to Hitler himself and somehow persuading him to refuse his orders, in the knowledge that if an SS patrol learned of it before the Americans arrived, both of them would likely be dead before morning. Consider being the mayor of Mühldorf, who convinced a Wehrmacht combat commander to stand down and hand the city over without a fight, having watched what happened to people who tried to do the same thing and got caught. These were acts of courage disguised as practicality. They were decisions made in the full understanding of the stakes, by people who had no guarantee of the outcome, in the service of an outcome that never got the recognition it deserved. What history remembers? The towns that survived the end of the Second World War without being destroyed are among the most visited places in Germany today. Heidelberg draws more than 3 million visitors a year to its Baroque streetscapes and its castle ruins, high above the Neckar River. Regensburg's medieval old town, declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is one of the most complete surviving examples of medieval urban architecture in Central Europe. Bamberg's timber-framed houses and four-spired cathedral attract visitors from around the world precisely because they stood through a war that destroyed so much of what surrounded them. Very few of those visitors know why these places survived. Very few know the names of the men and women who made the decisions in those final weeks, or understand the specific combination of pragmatism, courage, and good fortune that produced the stillness and the white cloth in the windows, rather than the artillery and the fire. The larger cities that chose resistance, or were forced into it, spent decades rebuilding. Some of them, like Frankfurt and Cologne, rebuilt so extensively that almost nothing of their pre-war architecture remains. In Cologne, the great Gothic cathedral is still standing, having survived bombing that destroyed the city around it, partly through luck and partly through deliberate effort by Allied air crews, who used it as a navigation landmark rather than a target. The cathedral stands today, surrounded by a city that is almost entirely post-war construction. The contrast is worth contemplating. One set of choices led to rubble and reconstruction. Another set of choices led to survival and preservation. And the second set required more courage, not less, because it had to be made quietly, secretly, against official orders, under the shadow of execution. Conclusion. War is a system that rewards a particular kind of courage, the aggressive kind, the kind that takes ground and holds position and refuses to yield. The men and women who fought in the Second World War showed that kind of courage in extraordinary abundance, on both sides and in every theater. But the end of a war is different from the middle of one, and the spring of 1945 in Germany was a moment when a different kind of courage was called for, the kind that looks at an impossible situation clearly and makes the decision that saves lives rather than taking them, even when that decision runs against orders, against ideology, against everything the surrounding culture had been demanding for 12 years. The German towns that survived without firing a shot were not passive. They were not simply lucky. In most cases, someone in them made a choice, made it knowing the risks, made it in the quiet, ordinary way that history rarely records. No speeches, no heroics, just a quiet conversation in a back room and a piece of white cloth produced at exactly the right moment on exactly the right morning. Those towns are still standing. The people who might have died in their streets grew old instead and had children, and those children had children. The churches still have their spires, the farmhouses still have their roofs. It's a different kind of victory. It doesn't have a monument, but it's real, and it's why history is not only about battles. Sometimes it is about the courage not to fight. If you found this story worth your time, please consider subscribing to WW2 Tales and hit the like button if this is the kind of history you want to see more of. Every subscribe helps this channel keep telling the stories that don't usually make it into the textbooks. Drop a comment below with the part of this story that stuck with you most. I read every single one. Script for WW2 Tales. All documented historical events cited are verified through multiple primary and secondary sources, including the National WW2 Museum, Wikipedia historical articles, Warfare History Network, Australian War Memorial Archives, and academic historical sources. The towns of Apolda, Heidelberg, Aschaffenburg, Werwolf, Düsseldorf, and others are documented historical examples. The Werwolf program, SS enforcement actions, and American artillery data are all sourced from verified historical records.